So we're going to start this unit on race and ethnicity, and then eventually we're going to look at sex and gender inequality as well. But we're going to start with race and ethnicity. And a couple of things I want to start out with are sort of the contemporary aspects of race and ethnicity in the United States. And there are really two things to keep in mind as we kind of move through this unit. The first is that conflict, discrimination, inequality between racial and ethnic groups remain deeply entrenched in the United States. This is also true of other multi-ethnic and multiracial societies, but kind of keep that in mind. This is true in spite of declines in open discrimination. So since, for example, the 1960s, we've seen declines in open individual level discrimination. We've had a series of civil rights laws that have improved conditions, and we've seen improving conditions for racial and ethnic groups in the United States. But nevertheless, there are still these deeply entrenched issues. That's also true, of course, in spite of the election of Barack Obama, for example, or the cultural popularity of Kanye and Beyonce, or the financial success of Oprah, right? So these are still mostly exceptions rather than the rule. So that's the first thing to keep in mind, right? That conflict, discrimination, and inequality between racial and ethnic groups still, to this day, deeply entrenched in the United States. Problems still need to be overcome. The second thing to keep in mind when we look at race and ethnicity in the U.S. and how it operates is that intergroup relations, the relations between racial and ethnic groups in this country, are becoming increasingly complex. They involve more groups and a wider variety of dynamics. Lots of examples here. One of the things we see in the wake of the 2020 census is the dramatic increase in multiracial identity, right? That the United States is not just a multiracial society in the sense that it's got a pluralistic makeup of different racial and ethnic groups, but individual people are increasingly coming from multiracial backgrounds. So that's something that's quite dramatic between the 2010 census and the 2020 census. Latinos have grown quite dramatically. Both Latino only and Latino and some other race have seen significant increases in their share of the total population in the United States. Immigration trends have shifted. Prior to the early 1920s, most immigration into the United States was either from Northern and Western European countries initially, then eventually Southern and Eastern European countries, and then for a long period of time, immigration into this country kind of slowed down significantly. And in the 1960s, when it picked up again, when laws were changed to liberalize America's immigration policies, immigration shot up again dramatically, but now the sending countries were East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Central and South America, right? Other parts of the world where immigration had not been so significant before the early 1920s, when it had slowed down as a result of other legislation. The United States is poised to become what's called a majority-minority country by mid-century. That means that the majority of the population will be made up of members of the minority groups that make up the United States. Whites will no longer be more than 50% of the total population. That does not, obviously, I hope, doesn't mean that there's necessarily going to be a power shift, but the demographic profile of the United States is changing quite dramatically, and that's going to create some interesting dynamics, right? That the relative population size can be a factor in racial and ethnic stratification, though not always. In 2007, the combined population of the four racial minority groups, the major racial minority groups in the United States, was about 30% of the population. And again, by 2050, that will be greater than 50%. So just kind of keep that in mind, right? That the racial dynamics in the United States are still kind of tense And there are a lot of unresolved conflicts, and especially legacy inequalities that are sort of holdovers from previous centuries of racial and ethnic discrimination. And race is becoming an increasingly complex concept that people grapple with in terms of identity, in terms of consequence of relative group size, and all of that. So keep those things in mind as you kind of move through this unit and you look at the racial dynamics. So let's talk a little bit about what we mean when we talk about race, and we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk a little bit about ethnic groups and some of the historical features of race and ethnicity in the United States, and sort of where these categories as social constructs kind of come from. Let's start, though, with definitions. So when we talk about race, we're talking about a socially defined group of people who are generally considered to be physically different in some way from others, and who regard themselves or are regarded by others as a distinct group. And when you look at that definition, you see that there are kind of two components to race as we define it here. The first is the social component, right? The sense of group identity that is held by members of the racial group, or that is held of the racial group by social others. That's the social component. Then there is the physical component, which are the markers that we use to categorize people, to put people into racial classifications. Race is a social construct, as you know, undoubtedly, as we've gone over multiple times before over the course of the semester. This is getting to be a relatively common sort of assertion, but again, we find there's a great deal of legitimacy to this, right? That race doesn't exist at a biological level. The markers, obviously, the markers that we use to organize people into racial categories are often rooted in physiology. So, for example, in the United States, one of the primary characteristics that we use to organize people into racial categories is skin color. Skin color is a function of melanin. Melanin is just a pigment. The more pigment you have in your skin cells, the darker your skin appears. The less melanin you have in your skin cells, the lighter your skin appears. So that is hereditary, right? Melanin is genetic, right? The amount of melanin in one's skin cells is a function of your genes. But the prevalence of dark skin in some regions of the world and the prevalence of light skin in other regions of the world is simply the process of natural selection over time, selecting for the skin color that is most advantageous given the physiological and the physiological needs of human organisms and the physical realities of the environments in which those organisms are living. So to make that a little bit less abstract, in equatorial regions, people are exposed to significant amounts of sunlight, which carries with it a risk, right? Increased exposure to ultraviolet radiation increases the risk of cancers. To protect against that, dark skin, right, helps to protect the body against the absorption of ultraviolet radiation. So over time, over generations of people being born and experiencing exposure to ultraviolet radiation, the ones that developed cancers, the people with lighter skin, would die earlier than the people with darker skin. And so darker skin, because it offers protections against ultraviolet radiation, was selected for through evolutionary processes. And over time, equatorial regions of the world, but also regions, you know, in extreme northern latitudes and southern latitudes where there is also significant exposure to sun, were also sort of similarly selected for. Darker skinned people are more likely to survive. In middle latitudes, as you go a little bit further north or south from the equator, the risk is too little exposure to ultraviolet radiation, right? Because the angle of the sun is different. It has to, you know, those light waves have to pass through a greater amount of atmosphere. And darker skinned people missed out on the advantageous features of exposure to ultraviolet radiation, specifically the production of vitamin D. So lighter skinned people, because they were able to absorb sufficient amounts of ultraviolet radiation, were able to create sufficient levels of vitamin D, and they were much more likely then to survive into adulthood and reproduce and pass on their genes. So skin color is an adaptation to environmental conditions, and specifically beneficial adaptation to environmental conditions. But skin color is not inherited in the same gene as the gene, say, for example, that controls hair color, or the gene that controls for one's hair texture, or the set of genes that control for the shape and color of a person's eyes. So all of those other physiological features are also criteria we use in making racial classifications, but they're not inherited as a package. They're inherited separately, right? So there isn't a black gene, there isn't a white gene, there isn't an Asian gene. Rather, the things that we use to organize people into black or white or Asian, for example, those features are separately heritable. And so what we do is we look at the variation, the physical variation between people, and we use that as the basis for assigning them to these socially constructed categories. And I'll talk a little bit about where the categories that we use in the U.S. come from in just a moment, but just understand that when we talk about race as a social construct, we're not saying that race isn't real. It's very real. We make it real. We attach consequences to being in one racial category versus another, sometimes to very extreme degrees. But while the variation in skin color is real, there's an arbitrariness to it, right? So you can imagine, just for a moment, a sort of thought experiment in which we line everybody up shoulder to shoulder from the darkest skinned person to the lightest skinned person. And we can look up and down that line of people, and we would see variation in skin color. That is a real thing. Where we draw the line between one racial group and another racial group, that's the arbitrary thing, right? There's, how light does a person's skin have to be before they cease being black or brown and they start being white, right? That's a judgment call. It's subjective. There's no way to falsify an assertion that a person, kind of, especially on the margins there, is in one racial category or another, right? It's an entirely subjective kind of evaluation. So when we say that race is a social construct, that's what we, and when I say we, I mean social scientists like sociologists and anthropologists and others. When we talk about race as a social construct, that's what we're getting at. We're sort of trying to establish the idea that the genetic variation that leads to variability in the appearance of human beings is a real thing, but that isn't the same thing as racial categories. Racial categories are shared understandings of the meaning and consequences of shared physical characteristics. So that's what makes race especially problematic, is that it's kind of sloppy. It's not a very useful concept for organizing people, because it is so capricious and arbitrary, especially at the margins. So it also doesn't really map well onto how people see themselves. I mean, there's some degree of that, right? One's race can be very much part of their identity, as we see with the sort of the social component of race as a concept. But what people are much more likely to see as defining their identity, or at least part of their identity, would be their ethnicity. So let's talk a little bit about ethnic groups instead. Now, ethnicity is also socially constructed. I don't want to suggest that it's somehow valid in a way that race isn't, right? That these are both socially shared understandings about how we divide people up into various categories. But an ethnicity or an ethnic group is generally a little bit more consistent with how people see themselves. And so for that reason, ethnicity tends to be a little bit more useful in describing groups of people because it's much more likely to be valid. It's much more likely to match with how they see themselves. So an ethnic group is a group of people who are generally regarded by themselves or by others as a distinct group, but the recognition here is based on social or cultural characteristics, so things like nationality or language or religion, rather than one's physical appearance. So a very dark-skinned person in the Dominican Republic, were they not to speak, were we not to know anything about sort of their cultural identity, we might say, oh, that's a black person. But that person probably in all likelihood sees themselves as Latino or Hispanic, and not black, or in addition to being black, might see themselves as Hispanic or Latino. So again, ethnicity is more consistent, as I said, with how people see themselves. It's also socially constructed. It's mostly ascribed. It's culturally and historically contingent. So what makes up an ethnic identity is a function of history and a function of geography and a function of social order and social organization. So, you know, just as sloppy in many respects as race, but more valid again because it more closely aligns with how people see themselves. All right, so let's wrap this up by talking a little bit about where our conception of race comes from in the United States. And again, every country is going to have sort of a different origin story, if you will, when it comes to race. I'm going to see if I can do this really, really briefly. So in the British American colonies, because that's really where all of this begins, you can see the conceptions of race emerging out of a set of economic factors and a set of economic conditions, specifically the practice of labor-intensive agricultural production. So, little tiny bit of history about the colonies. These are economic ventures, right? So people get permission from the crown to go over to British North America and establish a colony, Jamestown or something like that. And the idea here is that we're going to extract resources from North America, and we're going to take them back to Britain. And when they arrive in Britain, they're going to be manufactured into products, right? Goods that can be then sold. And the markets in which these goods are sold are going to be domestic markets, of course, back in Britain, but also back in the colonies, right? Those items are going to come back to the American colonies or the British colonies in North America to be sold back to the colonists. So cotton will not grow in England. England is damp. England is cool, right? It's the entirely wrong climate for the production of things like cotton or tobacco or rice or indigo or some of these other things. So you grow those things in the colonies, and then you put them on ships and you take them back to be manufactured in places like England. This is labor intensive, right? You need a lot of workers to produce these raw materials. And of course, because these are economic ventures, they have to be profitable. And one of the ways that you make an economic venture profitable is by controlling labor costs. So the workers for these agricultural colonies, these endeavors, were originally indentured servants, and they were from England, and they were from other parts of Britain, but primarily from England. So what would happen is, if somebody was in a debtor's prison, for example, a colonist, a person who'd gotten permission from the crown to establish a colony in British North America, would come in and they would pay off this person's debt. And now this person was kind of obligated to work for the person who now had a bond on their labor, because this is what we're talking about. We're talking about bonded labor. And they're put on ships, they're taken over to the British American colonies, and they work. And they work for a period of time. Usually a term of indentured servitude was going to be about 10 years. After 10 years, if you were still alive, then you're free. That's your debt is paid, and you're now a person living you're still a person of British citizenship, but you're living in these British colonies, and you can start your own farm, you can start your own business, you can go sell your labor to somebody who's willing to purchase it. Wage labor versus indentured servitude, two ways of bonding a person's labor. If I'm paying you a wage, let's say I pay you $100 a week to do some work for me. When I give you $100, then the labor that you owe me is a week's worth of labor. That labor that was yours now belongs to me because I've paid for it. I have a bond on that labor. In the same way that, if I've paid your debts and I've brought you over to Virginia Colony, you're going to work for me because I paid your debt. You now owe me. And when you finish satisfying the terms of our contract, then you'll be free. So we're really talking about different ways to kind of bond a person's labor to another person. And these indentured servants, these, in essence, slaves, they weren't permanent slaves, and they weren't slaves that could be bought or sold like property. That kind of slavery, what we call chattel slavery, comes a bit later. That is also, I suspect, what most people think of when they think of slavery. They think of people being bought and sold at auction. But again, slavery comes in lots of different forms, which is why it's better sometimes, I think, to think about this as all, systems that are designed to bond a person's labor to another person, and kind of leave it at that. And then we can look at the specifics of various iterations of that practice. So the first slaves in the British American colonies are white. It's not intentional. No one's thinking. I mean, people can see that people look different than other people. I don't want to suggest that there's something wrong with them and they don't see the fact that some people have dark skin and other people have light skin. But skin color back then doesn't really mean as much, or it doesn't mean the same things as it means, in the 1700s or the 1800s or the 2000s. So you have these white indentured servants working in the British American colonies, kind of all by themselves, up until 1619. In 1619, the first African slaves arrive in North America. They arrive in Virginia Colony. There are, I believe, about 24 African slaves that arrive in Virginia Colony in 1619, and they are just like white slaves. They're just indentured servants, right? And at the time that they finish sort of satisfying their term of indentured servitude, they go free, just like whites are going to go free. So again, the thing that matters here isn't whether you're white or black. The thing that matters is whether your labor is bonded to somebody through indentured servitude, or whether you're free, right? Whether your labor belongs to you. Once your labor belongs to you, you can sell it to whomever is willing to buy it. So for a variety of reasons, and again, I'm trying to keep this short, but for a variety of reasons, there are pressures that lead to an increasing reliance on labor from Africa. One, the climate of the British American colonies, especially the mid-Atlantic and South, is pretty harsh, especially for people who are acclimated to conditions in Britain, right? In the American Southeast, it's hot, it's humid. There are mosquitoes that carry diseases for which there aren't natural immunities that have built up in European populations. And so people die of things like malaria and other kinds of bloodborne diseases. African labor is more acclimatized to working in these kinds of conditions. So there's a kind of a preference there for African labor because it's more reliable in that sense. The other thing that's happening is that the ability of colonists to kind of go into debtors' prisons in Europe and just kind of buy up the labor of young, healthy men who you want to bring over, that's starting to diminish, right? That you've kind of tapped that supply of labor out, and now you have to increasingly recruit. And to recruit, you have to offer better incentives, right? As the supply of labor shrinks, the price of labor is going to go up. Now, the price is not measured in how many pounds you're going to pay, but rather how long the term of servitude is. So a typical term of indentured servitude, which had been, say, for example, maybe 10 years, can suddenly become as short as 7 or 5 years because, again, you're trying to get as many people to come over here as possible. So there's all of this pressure to sort of increasingly rely on African labor. Now, there's an interesting set of conditions that will result in the establishment of what we probably mostly think of when we think of slavery, which is chattel slavery. Chattel slavery really begins to be formalized and institutionalized in the British American colonies in the very early 1700s. So 1705, Virginia passes a series of laws that are designed to start kind of formalizing and institutionalizing bonded African labor with characteristics that we all come to associate with slavery, things like lifetime bondage. People are property who can be bought and sold. The thing that gives rise to this is a growing set of concerns among both the government of these colonies, like the local governance, which is kind of an extension of the power of the British Crown, and the plantation owners, the what we call the planter class. These are basically the aristocrats of the British American colonies. They own large amounts of land. They have significant numbers of indentured servants, both African and European indentured servants. The profitability of their enterprise is a function entirely of this kind of hopefully inexhaustible supply of inexpensive labor, right, which is going to allow them to maximize their profits. And one of the things that they are really afraid of is that these indentured servants, who vastly outnumber the planters, right? There are way more indentured servants than there are plantation owners. The fear is that these people are going to kind of recognize that they share a common set of interests, and they're going to turn on the aristocrats. They're going to turn on the government and the planter class and sort of engage in some form of rebellion. And the threat is exacerbated by the fact that you can also potentially, if you're this group of people, you can recruit additional support from among free farmers and artisans and craftsmen who don't own indentured servants because they don't have the financial wherewithal to do that. And so if you're a small farmer in Virginia colony and you are competing against this large plantation, which is producing all of its crops through the use of indentured servitude, it's going to cost you more to produce, which means that you're going to have a harder time recouping your costs than this other person who's kind of working with an economy of scale that's quite large and quite impressive. And so one of the events that seems to be pivotal in the emergence of this sort of shift is this event that happens in 1676 called Bacon's Rebellion. Now, Nathaniel Bacon was a landowner in Virginia colony who wanted Virginia colony to push its western border further to the west, with the idea that this would allow Bacon to expand his land holdings, and other people kind of jumped on that bandwagon because they wanted those opportunities as well. The problem, of course, is that this is land that has been sort of ceded by treaty to Native American populations who were displaced when the original colonists began to settle closer to the eastern shores, right? So the idea is that we've pushed indigenous populations a little bit further inland, but to kind of keep the peace, we've sort of promised them that they get to keep this land, right? We've signed treaties to that effect. And Bacon's essentially arguing that we should violate these treaties, and the British governor of Virginia colony, guy says, no, his name's Berkeley, by the way. Berkeley says, no, we're not going to do this. We're going to respect these treaties. And so Nathaniel Bacon decides that he and his fellow revolutionaries are going to overthrow the local government. Now, Bacon himself dies kind of during the planning stages of this. He dies of dysentery, but the rebellion actually occurs. It does not succeed, obviously. They do manage to burn Richmond, but the rebellion is put down. The collaborators and conspirators are hanged or otherwise punished. But this makes the planter class and the British government very nervous, right? Because these people are developing what Marx would call it class consciousness, right? They're recognizing that what's important about their sort of station in life is that they're kind of getting screwed by these aristocrats and their lackeys in the government. And so for the planter class and the British government, there is a kind of a crisis moment. We have to figure out a way to drive a wedge into this growing power base, and the easy way to do this is to organize the class of people who are laborers. We're going to organize them around how they physically appear. We're going to create race. Now, again, people saw that some people have dark skin and other people have light skin, but remember, that isn't very important, or at least not nearly as important as whether you are free or your labor is bonded. But now it's going to become everything, because what we're going to establish beginning in the late 1600s and the early 1700s is we're going to establish a system of lifetime bonded servitude, lifetime slavery, but it's going to be exclusively something that we subjugate blacks with, right? We're not going to do this to white people. But to do that, you have to kind of create blackness and you have to create whiteness as these kind of identities, so that you can put one group of people in conditions of lifetime servitude and other people, explicitly and expressly prohibit that from being the case. And so you see the creation of modern notions of not just race, blackness and whiteness, but also notions of racial superiority, right? The notion of white supremacy is very much at the foundation of this, because the reason you don't do this to white people, and the reason why you can and should do it to black people, is that white people are better than black people. So that notion of racial superiority gets cultivated and shared, because you're going to use that to justify the mistreatment of one group of people by another group of people, right? So say like a poor farmer, a poor white farmer is never going to own slaves because they don't have the financial capital to purchase slaves. But the way that you sort of incentivize their acquiescence or their agreement to this system is to say, first of all, we have this nice little thing called whiteness, and we are, sort of civilized, and we are the descendants of European powers and culture and all that is sort of civilized and decent about the world. And these people, they came out of the jungle. They're not Christians. They don't speak English, right? All of these reasons why we can kind of justify dehumanizing them, which you kind of have to do if you are going to sell them as property. If you're going to take their children, for example, and sell them to other people, if you're going to break up marriages and you're going to destroy families, you have to be able to sort of say, it's okay if we do it to these people because they're not like these people over here. So we kind of start to think about all the different ways in which you have to institutionalize that. You have to formalize that and put it into law. You have to enforce those laws. You have to have, for example, people who will control the black population, which again are slaves, right? By definition, if you're black, you're subject to enslavement. It's a racial caste system. If you think back to the previous chapter when we talked about stratification systems and caste systems, are those really, really rigid systems in which there's no mobility. You're either in one position or another. So chattel slavery in the British American colonies, and then of course in the United States after the country is established in 1776, that racial caste system is created so that we can continue the practice of slavery. It's much easier to manage if you know right away who the slaves are and who the free people are. And the slaves are the ones who are black, and the free people are the ones who are white. And if you're a white person and you're walking down the road and you see a runaway slave, you can grab that runaway slave and you can take it to the nearest plantation, and you can return it to the plantation owner for a bounty. You get some money for this. And the way you know that the person you see on the road is a runaway slave is they're black, right? Because, if somebody is black, then definitionally they're going to be slaves. So when we think of modern notions of race in the United States, right, our understanding of race and our understanding of sort of what it means to be black and white, and historically what that's meant, you have to be able to link it to those economic pressures that kind of become increasingly difficult to manage when your labor pool is racially mixed. But if you can create racially segregated labor in through this racial caste system of chattel slavery, then it's much more manageable. So when we think about race in the United States, that's where it comes from. And then you systematically oppress people in this class that you're dehumanizing and whose labor you're exploiting, and you do that for a few hundred years. And in all honesty, the first racial caste system of chattel slavery gets replaced by a second racial caste system of Jim Crow, right? So after the Civil War, we abolish slavery. We turn former slaves into citizens, and we grant them equal protections and the rights of citizenship. But the pressures to create inexpensive pools of labor still remain. And there's a relatively easily culturally identifiable and physically identifiable and vilified group of people who you can start to oppress and exploit economically. You can't do it through chattel slavery anymore because that's been expressly prohibited by the Constitution, but you can still set up other practices that create, systems of slavery or near slavery in all but name. So like the sharecropper system that kind of comes to replace the plantation system works virtually the same. And the group that ends up economically disadvantaged, of course, was the same group of people who were economically disadvantaged under chattel slavery. So really, in the United States, we've really only been free of all of that, even in some nominal sense, since the 1960s. So the vast majority of the history of America has unfolded against a backdrop of systemic and institutionalized racial oppression and the operation of two very, very distinct racial caste systems in the form of chattel slavery and then subsequent to that, Jim Crow. So these things will come back and have an impact on inequality and racism and discrimination. But I wanted everyone to have a good sense of the origins, a good sense of the roots of all of this. And so that's about the shortest. Obviously, there's a lot more to say, but we also have a limited amount of time, and you don't want to be watching an 8-hour video. So we'll talk more about this in subsequent lectures, and of course any questions that you have you can always bring up in class. So I guess until next time, I'll say take care.